the 110,000 folks plus should really be put in places that we might call incarceration camps or American concentration camps. And the reason for that is, if you use those terms, it no longer is something that was done for the benefit, but it was done because the government wanted to do so. Controlling the vocabulary controls the narrative. The narrative is that process of taking innocent people, American citizens and their parents, into places simply because they were of a particular ancestry.
And all of a sudden they come in the dead of night, knock on the door, and then taking away somebody in handcuffs. This could be your fate if you're going to start to create trouble.
The instinct to control and to repress through the creation of a shadow system of law enforcement is, I think, what links Guantanamo to Loop.
Tule Lake had a stockade, a prison inside a concentration camp, in which soldiers clearly tortured people.
Oh, Rosalyn, you're muted. You're muted, Rosalyn.
Hi. Hi. I didn't click hard enough. Hi, welcome everybody to A Bitter Legacy. And for those of you who were able to see the incredible documentary by filmmaker Claudia Katayanagi, it talks about the untold story of the citizen isolation camps. And here with me today, we have the venerable Art Hansen, who the community knows for many, many years. I believe you've been doing this research for over 50 years, to talk a little bit about this episode of the World War II concentration camp experience. And of course, Claudia to talk about some of the current day aspects of what she sees today as a filmmaker, journalist. So, without further ado, just to start it off, Claudia, what are some of the finer points that you wanted to get the message out for A Bitter Legacy about these camps? Can you talk a little bit about that and why you made it?
Okay. I mean, to me, I always like to go into untold stories, the stories that are just not well known. And I provide a pretty broad history of the concentration camps within A Bitter Legacy film. I was astounded when I found out about these citizen isolation centers. And it was like shocking to find that, the government almost tried to cover these camps up, until people like Art Hansen, who, really delved into the story and did the oral histories of these people, that I thought, oh my gosh, let's discover more about what those are. How do they even manage to do that? What was the mechanism that they used? And like it's in the trailer, it says it was a precursor to Guantanamo. I mean, it was literally a rendition. Like Dan Harada, whose painting is paintings are in the film, talked about in the dead of night, knocking on the door and they pull him out, and he doesn't know where he's going. Then he ends up directly going to Loop. But it was just it's shocking to find out that all this was going on within this whole WRA system, supposedly a civilian system of governance. So I thought I was shining a light on that story.
Yeah, and for the benefit of the folks that have not seen your great movie and documentary, can you just give a simple overview of how these camps were created? And then I wanted to have a follow-up question to Art Hansen. Yeah.
Well, within this, within the context of A Bitter Legacy, this after Pearl Harbor, I mean, there were. I'm doing it. This is about the incarceration history, and I've been spending years saying this is not the internment history. The government, called them relocation. That was their euphemism for the system. But we've come to know them now as incarceration camps or American concentration camps. Started by the Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt, and it was they really were able to create the military zone and then put all the Japanese Americans away from the West Coast and into these 10, first the assembly centers, which you see, some of which you see in the movie. And then from there, they put them into the more permanent incarceration centers like Topaz and Manzanar and Heart Mountain and all the 10 that you see in the movie that are covered in the movie. And it was at Manzanar where people were, were becoming aware of, when they started the loyalty oath questionnaire, people really began to question, wait a minute, this isn't illegal. We shouldn't be put in these places. They're stealing our food. They're asking us to declare our loyalty, or that we're not. Anyway, the question, without going into the whole details of the loyalty questionnaire, they started to isolate people who were questioning the authority, because they realized that, hey, people, if everybody starts thinking in the same way, they could have, when people start resisting, that builds momentum, and they could have a real problem in the camps. So they started pulling out, and after the Fred Tayama was beaten up by the people in Manzanar, the government did bring in the military, and they came in and when they shot the protesters who were trying to get Harry Iwano released. Then they really put them. That's when they started the process of creating the citizen isolation centers. The first one was Moab, and then when that became, everybody said, "Oh, well, let's get rid of our troublemakers." So after Manzanar, then Gila River had a Key Club, and so they started, let's get rid of some of those guys. Key were already questioned as being problematic, because they were American citizens. They were educated in Japan, and therefore the government said, "Oh, well, they're loyal to Japan." No, it's just that they were educated there, because there's so much discrimination here. They couldn't get a good education. They couldn't go to the good schools here in America. Hey, let's go to Japan and get a good education. So when they came back, they were considered to be, a little, their loyalty was questioned, and they were put, a lot of the people in these isolation centers happened to be Kibe. And then when the questionnaire, the people in Tule Lake were, who refused to answer the loyalty oath at all, and then put into the Camp Tule Lake isolation center, then those were put into the Moab, and then it got to be too full at Moab. So they decided, they went to a Navajo reservation, a school in the Navajo territory, in Loop.
So Moab, just for Moab is in Utah.
Moab's in Utah,
and now Loop is in
Arizona. Yeah, and they keep adding more and more people to Loop, and I think eventually there were about 83 men, only men, were placed in these isolation centers. And then, you see in the history that, well, they were ultimately decided, it was determined that it was illegal to even do this. And so the Solicitor General declared these isolation centers to be illegal. They closed them, but instead of releasing everybody back into the other incarceration camps, they put them in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, and that created the prison within the prison there. So
yeah, it seems like, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, it seems like it's a story about how the government treated dissidents and they deemed troublemakers. And this follow-up question to this for Art is that, I know, Art, you've been had the privilege of interviewing a number of folks like Harry Ueno and other dissidents. And can you talk a little bit more in detail about how you came to understand, what they went through and how the government used them or treated them and moved them around in these citizen isolation camps?
Yes, actually, in my own situation, in 1960, when I was a senior at University of California, Santa Barbara, I had a professor that was a visiting professor from Harvard in a sociology class, and we were asked to write about some, incident or issue or something within in ethnic history and everything that would be very revealing and helpful and everything. And I knew Japanese American students, and I knew a little bit about the camps, but not very much. And so I ended up writing this paper, and it was a shoddy paper in the sense that, all of the articles that appeared in journals at that time, like Newsweek and Time and the like, they called the incarceration experience a blessing in disguise. That it broke up the ghettos. It got people to go to these camps where now they could be cheerleaders and quarterbacks and everything else like this. And I fell right into that trap and titled my paper unimaginatively, "A Blessing in Disguise." So then I had to live down that situation. And as time went on, et cetera, and I started out doing work in Anglo-American intellectual history. I wasn't doing anything with Japanese Americans. I finished my dissertation, and I decided during the time that the riots were going on the campuses, including Cal State Fullerton and everything and we had a major showdown. It looked like a preview for me of what I ended up studying in the Manzanar riot, with the police all lined up and then the dissidents lined up against them and everything. So that really got me involved in it. So I said, what I want to do is to concentrate my attention on Japanese American history. And so I had friends and colleagues who had been at Manzanar. So I chose to work on the Manzanar riot, which had not really been written about very much. And all of the details about that were down at the UCLA Research Library. And then in addition to that, I started interviewing people who could give us first-person testimonies about it. So that's how it got started. And in writing about the Manzanar riot, I tried to revise the perception of, like Ted talks about, changing the narrative. I wanted to change it. It wasn't a riot, it was a revolt. That there were dissidents in the camp, and they did mobilize their discontent, and they did take issue not only with the government and the War Relocation Administration, but the Japanese Americans who were accommodationists, who were collaborators with the government, and particularly the people who were the leadership of the Japanese American Citizen League. And so I tried to show in that article that if you took a look at what happened in Manzanar leading up to the riot, and instead of giving the perspective from the government's point of view or from the JCL point of view, if you gave it from an ethnic perception, from the people who were in the camps, you could see these things and how this came about. And then the one person I wasn't able to interview very much that I wanted to interview was Harry Ueno, because he was the central figure in the Manzanar riot. And everybody told me he's in Japan or he's dead. And then out of the blue, all of a sudden, Don Hatta, got in touch with Sue Embry and said, Sue, Harry's alive and he wants me to interview him, but I don't know that much about that stuff. He said, would you be willing to? She said, I'll only do it if I do it with Art Hansen, but he's an oral historian. So we went up to San Jose in 1976 and we did an interview with Harry. And in the course of that interview is when I started to find out all about not only what happened at Manzanar, but after Harry left Manzanar and he ended up at Moab, an isolation center, and then he went to another isolation center at Loop, and then he went to a segregation center at Tule Lake. So then that helped me put together the sort of narrative. And I've been spending the rest of my time really dealing with resistance of all sorts. I have a book coming out in a couple of months, University Press of Colorado, and it's called Beyond the Betrayal. And it is the memoir of Yosh Koramiya, who was one of the 300 draft resistors in the camps during World War II, but the only one who has written a book-length memoir. So I've edited that memoir, and Eric Muller, who was involved very centrally in A Bitter Legacy, the film, has written the forward to that. And then I've had, I'm trying to think, Lawson Inada, the great poet, had written a poem in honor of Yosh Koramiya, and so I've included that poem as an afterword, and then Lawson has written another poem that's in a preface to it. That book but that is something that's just addressed a little bit in the Bitter Legacy film, but that becomes a very important sort of thing.
Yes.
And the other sort of work that I did that's related to resistance, in 2018, I edited the memoir of James Omura, James Matsumoto Omura, and he's the one that stood up at the hearings, the Toland Committee hearings in 1942, and said, "Has the Gestapo come to America?" And then he was the only journalist that stood behind the draft resistors and defended them. And how was he treated by the JACL? He was treated as a pariah. He was treated as an outcast and everything. They made it difficult for him to get any jobs and everything. He even broke up their marriage and stuff. So, that book came out. And then I wrote another book of my essays over the years called Barbed Voices in 2018. And what that does is to track the kind of resistance that went on in all of the different camps, not just Manzanar. And I spent most of my time, in the beginning of my career studying on Manzanar, but then I branched out there, went to all the different camps, interviewed people at all these places, visited the sites, visited Moab, visited Loop, etc. So, I'm kind of in it up to my neck and everything. So the most important things that I think for anybody watching this to read really quickly, because they don't need the long story, we can get a short one. But I wrote the entry for the Dencho Encyclopedia that deals with the Moab and Loop isolation centers. And so they should look at that. They probably should look at the book Barbed Voices, because they're included. At the beginning of it is the essay, which previously was in a journal. It's now in that book on the Manzanar riot. So they should take a look at that. I don't say this as self-promotion. I say it as a way of being able, to show what a klutz I was and what a klutz most people were, to be able to think that 120,000 people are going to be so passive and just say Shagata Ganai and not really be able to stand up on their back legs and fight back. And so this film shows how much of a fight was put up in the camps. And that's the new narrative that has to be followed. And that's the new narrative for America that has to be followed.
Very good. I think, back in 1976, that was quite a while ago. And that's when I guess you had your reckoning, but to take it all the way to the present, that's very impressive. I just want to have a follow-up question that when you met and interviewed Harry Ueno, as an oral historian, what was your first impression, and how did he come off to you? And what do you think of him?
He was one of the kindest people I'd ever met, and Sue Embry and I, just had a wonderful interview with him. And the only squiggle was this: in the middle of the interview, I asked him. I said, a lot of people claim that you assaulted Fred Tayama, and Fred Tayama was the biggest name among the JACL people at Manzanar. And on the night of December 5th, 1942, that beating occurred. And that, because of that beating and Tayama identified Harry as one of his assailants. There were 6 of them involved, and that Harry was the leader of the pack and everything. And so, but Harry claims that he didn't see anything or anything like this. But so I said, Harry, you have to tell me, were you involved in the beating of Fred Tayama, or do you know who was involved in the beating of it? And he said, there are some things you don't talk about. And so I turned off the tape recorder, and I gave him a moment to be thinking about things. And I said, you have a right to your privacy, and you don't have to answer any questions I ask you. But I think you do have some obligation to posterity, that at some point down the line, when you feel comfortable talking about this situation, that you reveal this. And I go into this at great detail in 3 different afterwords of articles that I have in Barb Voices. And then finally, years later, Harry wrote me a letter, and Harry said, it's been all these years that I haven't said anything, but I will tell you because I trust you. He said that I was involved in the beating, and this is what occurred on that particular night. Well, for me, I had already said before in the article that I wrote that I believed Harry when he said that he didn't believe it. And I said, maybe it's true and maybe it's not. I tend to believe him. And I think that Harry was honored that I had said that. But, here he is revealing this stuff to me. Then I went to interview him about Martha Nakagawa, who's a journalist. Martha Nakagawa's father was at Loop, and she wanted me to talk to Harry and see what he remembered about her father. And he said, when I start talking to him, I said, Harry, could you tell me anything you know about Martha's father? And he said, well, the Tule Lake people came in late, and they sort of hung around together, and they were much younger. And he said, I didn't have much to do with them. I can't even remember his name, like that Nakagawa and stuff. So in any event, then he went off script again, and then he just started talking more about, all the people that were involved in it. And then it turns out the people he was talking about were the people that we put on and you've used this photo in your film, the picture I used on the cover of Manzanar Martyr. When they were at Loop, they got together, and basically that was a reunion picture. It was a reunion picture of the people who were involved in the beating. So when Lane Hirabayashi, who was the editor of the University Press of Colorado, who was editing my book, asked me a series of questions. He said, well, what did you think of this now that Harry has been revealed as being involved? I said, I haven't changed my opinion of Harry. I said, I've read so much about the French resistance movement and the resistance movements all over the world. Sometimes, I don't believe in war, but I'm not an all-out pacifist. There are certain things that have to cause you to stand up and fight. And I said, this is what he was doing and everything. And Fred Tayama wasn't beaten that badly. They were acting like he was so badly beaten. He was out in a day from the hospital. And then he was at Cow Creek, the CCC camp where they took the accommodationists and the people that were JACL supporters. And then within a few days, he was teaching Japanese at a naval language school in Colorado. So, it wasn't like they were just roughing him up a little bit to show him, that they're not trying to kill him, roughing him up to show him that this is, you don't rat on people and stuff. And you don't support the people and take advantage of all these opportunities that you get that we as Kibe, for example, don't get. And I was always interested in the Kibe because the Kibe were so targeted, even within the Japanese American community, as bad and stuff. And actually, when you look at the Kibe, they were the people that were the backbone of the MIS. And without the military intelligence service, where would we have been? They probably cut short the war by 2 years and everything. But even in the camps, they were people, for instance, that weren't just troublemakers. They were people that raised questions. And so, and then that was true at Loop. It was true at Moab. It was true at Tule Lake. Of course, a lot of them then became, people who were gave up their citizens. They were renunciants. They renounced their citizenship. But nobody has written very much about the Kibe. I mean, there are a couple of books that deal with Kibe, and I cite them in everything that I write. But somebody really needs to do a full-bore study of the Kibes during the period of World War II. I mean, and they were left out of the narrative and everything. And this is part of the thing of Claudia's film, is to change the narrative, and to have these untold stories told and everything. And the Kibe story is one of the untold stories, as the draft resistors were an untold story. Now it's been a told story, by other people as well as me.
Well, thanks to you, a lot of these important stories are now being told, and I can't wait for your books to come out. For the benefit of people, I think, Claudia, you were able to share some of the photographs of these camps, right? So maybe Kimiko, can you talk about them, and maybe Kimiko could show them on the screen?
Well, shall we go first from, at the Manzanar riot, I also want to mention the doctors who were taking care of the guys who were, Tama, and they did the government, again, was trying to change the narrative. Oh, they were, when they killed these two guys in that uprising. They brought out the military and they pointed guns towards them. They shot
two young men were killed.
2 young men were killed. And they said, oh, they were charging towards them. But Dr. Goto was shown, in the movie Farewell to Manzanar, and I included some of that footage in the film, that as he was doing the autopsy report, he shows that the bullets had to come from the back. They were shot in the back. That's another example of trying to change the narrative. Oh, they were charging, we did this in self-defense. No, they were going away because they put out the equivalent of a gas, a pepper spray or whatever, that kind of thing. And so everybody was running away, and that's when they were shot and killed. And so Dr. Goto, because he said, no, they were shot in the back, he was then removed from Manzanar and sent to Topaz, because they didn't want his voice again being raised. And Dr. Mira, who's also in my film, he's the one who found Fetayama, hiding under the hospital bed, so that because they were charging, after they were beating him up, he ran and he hid under the bed, and you see that scene. And so it's people who want to telling the truth, and they're being demonized and gotten rid of, as it were, from the main narrative too. I wanted to interview, Dr. Goto's, but of course he's passed away.
Yeah, I had a chance to meet Dr. Muda, who lived in the Santa Cruz area.
And apparently she's still alive at 107.
Oh my goodness.
God,
but the sad thing is that it was the officials that, the stolen sugar and the valuables that Harry Bueno discovered and called attention to the injustice and the unfairness. But it was officials and the government that, created this situation so untenable that 2 innocent lives were killed, essentially, 17, 18, very sadly. So, but can we share some pictures of, let's see, Moab, of some of these
yes,
photographs?
Kimiko is in charge of that.
Yeah, and so can you describe these?
Well, I think Art pointed me to these photographs, and this was when it was a CCC, a Civil Conservation Corps camp, before it became a citizen isolation center. And the main road, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the road, and you would go in that diagonal. That's how you would enter the Moab site. I have recently gone there I was invited with the Utah State Senator, Jenny Iwamoto. They're now going to, the hill behind that you see in the background is where they've discovered millions of dinosaur fossils. So the state of Utah has designated money to turn this into a state park. So they're going to feature the dinosaur museum, the park behind there. They're also going to put a little visitor center there to talk about Moab. So that bill has passed, and so that was interesting. Of course, none of the buildings are there today, and I've shown some current photographs that of the site itself. And when I was there a few years ago, they still had some remnants of when it was a well, the Dalton Wells. So you saw somewhere where the water, they would capture water. But I think that's now since been demolished.
Talk about isolation. It's pretty isolated. And a shout out to Annie Iwamoto, state senator, to work with her Republican colleagues to make this a reality. And I believe they're going to try to have a memorial marker to designate the Moab site and to tell this story, this untold story there. So,
and here's the Block 42 resistors who were taken from Camp Tule Lake and brought to Moab. This is a shot of Moab in the background. You see the barracks.
And can you we didn't go into that. Can you describe the resistance that happened at Block 42 in Tule Lake? And it's a different story from the Manzanar story, because you and Art Hansen described that, the Block 42 story, and how they ended up in Moab and or Loop. Yeah.
You want to take it, Art? But well, you'll see a picture. There's a picture I was going to show of them when they were in Tule Lake. But these are the guys who were in the film. I actually give their names, and one of them is the brother of the Tanimoto's brothers, who are Jim Tanimoto is currently active and talking about this history, because they were the ones who were brought out into the courtyard and had to face a firing squad in the dead of night.
Maury. Yeah. Well,
Maury and Jim Tanimoto were also involved in that. And as he describes it, I mean, if you get pulled out of your bed in the middle of the night, thrown into put into a courtyard with a light shining on you, with finding yourself facing men with, rifles pointed at you. And apparently one or two guys basically went a little, yes, he had post-traumatic stress and was never quite the same after that. But that kind of abuse went on, and almost all these camps on some level, and then they would, not talk about it. But so
they were isolated and they were resisting.
They didn't resist. They just refused to answer the questionnaire. Are you a loyal American citizen? They had to say yes or no. They just said we refuse to answer. Are you loyal to Japan? They just refuse to answer. Are you serving the armed forces? They refuse to answer. So because that was seen as resistance, they were then
isolated and removed.
I think Roger Daniels makes it very clear in the film how large a percentage of the so-called people, the no-nos at Tule Lake, never said no. They said nothing on the things, and they were just treated as though they were no and everything to the questions. On that, I'm not an expert on the Block 42 incident, but I think the person that is an expert on it is Barbara Takei, and Barbara Takei has written the entry on the Tule Lake Segregation Center in the Densho Encyclopedia. So I think the readers should look at that. She's writing now a full-bore book on Tule Lake with Roger Daniels. So this, and Roger Daniels, if you think I'm venerable, Roger Daniels is in his late 90s and everything, and he's still working at things. It's unbelievable. He's lost most of his vision and everything, and he still gets things magnified so that he can work. And so he's just an amazing, and he's even pitching in on this stuff with Topaz on Claudia on the critique on what happened on the unearthing of that monument to the Wakasa. Yeah. So yeah. But,
yeah.
We can see another. Can we see another photo? Can we go into another photo?
Okay. Yeah, this, as you see, is an aerial shot of the old loop. But this is the whole board. When it was a boarding school for the Navajo children, before it became an isolation center. And so this shows the extent of the project. And the dormitories, you see the shops, they had a hospital, they had a big kitchen. And at this, if you were to go there today, you'll see the Presbyterian Church is still standing, and the administrator's building, the supervisor's residence, is now owned by, and you see in the film, by a Navajo tribal member. But everything else has been razed.
So they removed the children from the school temporarily, and then brought in the.
They would torture the Navajo children at this school. I mean, I interviewed some Navajo tribal members, and as children, they were brought here, and they were tortured if they spoke their native language. And ironically, I just want to make a quick little mention that, ironically, there was at that Presbyterian church, there was a young boy who was raised with this, the Navajo tribal members, so he understood the Navajo language. He was responsible for helping to create the code talkers, for using the Navajo language, during World War II, for the code talkers. And that happened at Loop. He lived in Loop as a side story. In the movie, you see the Native American a couple, Joe and his wife, Joe Smith and his wife. There they are, and they're talking about they would come to the Loop Trading Post. It was owned by different people than the ones at the Sunrise, and they would come with their sheepskins and trade, for goods. And you'll see there was a shot inside the trading post. Yeah, they would, get their flour and other goods. They trade there. You can get beautiful blankets and other blankets, and they would come trade. Well, this was owned. This particular site was owned by the other owners who refused when the Japanese Americans were brought there. They asked if they could, buy some things. There's some sundries and cigarettes and toiletries there, and they go no. But the people who were at the Sunrise Trading Post down the road said, no, we'll provide that. Of course not. So they would drive their truck full of goods inside the Loop.
Take me back.
And then he said as you say in the movie, you saw in the film, that they said these guys were so trustworthy. They would go there and, they would basically let them just leave their own money. They leave, buy the things and leave the money there. And the shot is before it was an isolation center, and then the Navajo tribal members would come there. There's their farmers market.
So why were they denied at one place and allowed at another? Just they didn't.
Why? Say that again.
Why were some denied access? Some of the Navajo.
Well, the Navajo were just told, you don't want to know about this. They weren't allowed to even go in there. It was the military police.
I see. It was military, but it was converted to the isolation military.
Yeah, when it was an isolation center, they were just told, you don't even look in there. You don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
So it was the trading posts were run by Caucasians, and they were allowed to go in and offer their goods to the prisoners there. And so
so there was some interaction with the Loop Japanese American.
They couldn't go out. They
Right.
could not go out.
They
but
could not go out, but they could
in with
interact.
They could buy.
They could buy goods if they had the funds.
Yeah.
Or
They had a few jobs that they could make money, but by and large, most people, well, in fact, this is a painting by Dan Harada, Katayanagi Dan Harada, one of the Loop prisoners. And he painted this as a photograph of the Loop administrator's home. It's one of the few areas that had that much greenery. And they hired a Japanese American guy to be their gardener. So that's why it's so green and it's so green and lush. And in fact, the administrator at this house had children, and he hired, I forget his name now, I should have remembered his name, to be the babysitters when they went into town. This is Paul Robertson's family.
Okay. So can we talk a little about, one more picture. This is the Cow Creek. Can you talk about?
Yeah. This is where the collaborators were sent. After Fred Time was beat up, they decided to separate a lot of the JCL members so they wouldn't get beat up, and so they were put for their safety in this Cow Creek camp. So it is technically an isolation center, but they were allowed to eat with the guards. I mean, they got released early, so it wasn't open for very long. But I did go when I shot there for my movie. There were 2 or 3 buildings that still exist if you go up there, and they were in the process of renovating them. So if you if you're willing to drive to Death Valley,
is it close to Manzanar?
Death Valley.
Further south.
Not close. It's but if you Google it, you can just see Cow Creek, Death Valley. I forget exactly what I did a whole 3,000-mile drive to get a lot of shots, so I've kind of lost track.
Then, so can we talk about some of the administrators? And I think it's touched upon a little bit in the movie, but then Art, you were able to interview one of them, Robertson, I believe.
Yeah, Paul Robertson.
Paul Robertson. Can you describe, did that make a difference in terms of who was the administrator in charge of, the camps and how prisoners were treated?
A huge difference. In the film, Tatsushima likens Ray Best, who was the original director. At first, he was a director at Moab, and then he came over to Loop. But then after several months, he left, and then he was replaced by Paul Robertson. And Ted says that when he was in school, the principal was always kind to people and outgoing, but the person that was the heavy was the vice principal. The vice principal was the disciplinarian. He took care of the roughs and stuff like this. Well, that was Ray Best. But in contrast to that, you have this very benign person, Paul Robertson. Paul Robertson was trained in architecture and law, and he was really a bright guy. But he was very religious. He later on became a pastor. When he was there, he was kind to the people. He treated them like human beings and everything. And as Claudia said, he even entrusted the so-called inmates with being babysitters for his children. And so he was well loved by him, and he was promised by the. Excuse me, somebody's knocking at our door. Debbie, could you get it? Okay. Anyway, he was promised by this door knocking. Paul Robertson was promised that when they were moved from Loop to Tule Lake, they would not be put in the stockade. But when they got there, they were all put into the stockade immediately. So they were put in a prison within a prison and treated as pariahs right from the get-go. And this having come from where they were treated like human beings by Robertson. Fortunately, Robertson was the associate director at Tule Lake. And so they still had his presence there, and he still continued his relationship with these people who he had known from Loop. And he was very kind to them, people like Harry Ueno and others at Tule Lake. So, yeah.
And Ben, he was at Tule Lake as well.
He was the director. That's why he left Loop, to take over as a director. And I think was a very hard-edged person. The only things that I could say on his behalf was that he was quite kind to Harry Ueno. He said, Harry, you've got your wife and you've got your 3 kids all at Manzanar. They haven't seen you for a long, long time and everything else. And you're renouncing your citizenship. This is a mistake. Japan right now, people are starving. There's no food, no jobs, and everything else like that is not a place for you to go. And he said, I think you should keep your nose clean here, stay out of politics and everything. And Harry did do that. And so did Joe Kurohara, who was another, rebellious person at Manzanar, another leader, dissident leader. And they both stayed out of politics at Tule Lake. But Joe was true to his word. He said, you're treating me like a quote unquote Jap. And if you're going to treat me like that, he said, I'm going to be a 200% JAP. And he said that he's giving up the American citizenship And he did renounce it, and he stayed with it. He went to Japan. He never came back to the United States. This is a guy who was a veteran of World War I. I mean, this was an exceedingly patriotic and respectable person, but he was true to his word. He went not back because he'd never been to Japan before. And his Japanese was kind of loosey-goosey. He went back to Japan and he lived there. And the only thing he did later on was he wrote this wonderful book about bonsai. It was a fantastic book, that he wrote, and he gave an autographed copy to Harry Ueno. When I interviewed Harry, he showed me the book that he got from Joe Kurohara. So, yeah.
Yeah, another tragic figure in the whole World War II story.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to the website of A Bitter Legacy, you'll see that there's also a book by Eileen Tamura who talks about the whole story, Joe Kurihara's whole story.
She's written a wonderful biography
right.
You've got to get that. It's a great book.
Talk about a dissident who, a person who protested true to his word. And, he was one of the 13. They had originally a committee of 13 who were appointed to talk after the Manzanar riot to help intercede with the administration and the prisoners.
And I'm happy to say that a number of years ago when her book came out, she came over from Hawaii where she lives, and I drove her to Manzanar and introduced her. She was the featured speaker. She was the keynote speaker at the Manzanar pilgrimage. And she gave a really great talk at that. And she's a wonderful person. And that's a fantastic book. Anybody should read her book on Joe Kurohara.
Yes.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes to go, but I wanted to ask you, fast forward to some of the, we're talking about untold narratives, and, this documentary is an excellent way to take a look at the untold narratives, right? And I know, Claudia, you're working on the Department of Justice internment camp stories on your next featured documentary. But fast forward to today or in recent years, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this or take away from A Bitter Legacy? And how can young people understand this history better and learn from it, and then either move on from there or to get involved or be conscious of, what happens today in terms of policies, dissidence, resistance, speaking up, taking action?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I want to thank the Tadaima group, Kimiko Mara, especially because she has assembled an amazing group of, historians and documentarians. I mean, this is an extremely amazing learning platform. If you attend any of these pilgrimages, you just learn. I mean, if you're you've learned about family. A lot of families don't talk about their incarceration history. So here you come here, and then you start conversations with your family. I mean, as I said, as Ted says in The Bitter Legacy, when people just have this social amnesia, let's forget about that. But when you learn, as you learn more, and you bring up conversations in the family, sometimes it is revealed. If you just go explore yourself, you'll find out a lot of history. And then when you learn from this, you realize, you see the injustice. History is being repeated constantly, and false narratives are told. And recently there was a desecration of an important site in Topaz, and so there are now a group of people who are Topaz descendants and even survivors who know about Wakasa, who was murdered at Topaz. And Nancy Yukai had discovered through the National Archives where that stone would quite possibly be. I mean, he was murdered, and the camp had a funeral service for him, and a lot of the Issei wanted to build a stone to commemorate him. He was shot walking his dog. He was an innocent man shot by a sentry, by a shotgun from one of the towers, and they did a false narrative. Oh, he was trying to escape. No, he had gone out. There are people who said that he walked his dog daily along that portion of the fence. So it's not as if he was trying to escape. He was just walking his dog. But that cemetery was moved, and they said, "Oh no, the government story was that oh no, he was trying to escape," and they never corrected that story. And when the East State said they're going to build a stone to honor him, they said you had to destroy it. Well, what they did is they buried it, and so for 70, almost 80 years, this monument has been buried at the site on Toll Pass. And when Nancy said, "Oh, I think I know where it is," there was the group of people who said, "Well, we'll fund an archaeological, group to help uncover this actual stone. Since we have an idea of where it is, we'd like to preserve it, preserve the site, and have the stone removed in a preservation according to preservational standards." Well, the Topaz board decided they would just dig it up. While they were digging up, picking up garbage in Block 42, they said, "Oh, let's just dig up this stone." Well, they desecrated this very sacred spot, and so a group of we're people who are conditioned to protest and who have a voice. I mean, our ancestors, our families were there, and to desecrate this spot, we want to move forward and basically say we all have a say in how our history is told and how we honor people like Mukasa, the people there. In my film, I'm also doing a film on the DOJ camp. So here I spent 6 years saying, no, there's not internment. This is incarceration. Well, now I'm doing a film about the real internment camps, and there were more than 100 different sites that were used to. The very first person to be arrested was a Buddhist priest in Hawaii. Way before, I think an hour before martial law was actually declared, they'd already arrested this Buddhist priest. There were 10 ships that came from Hawaii. 8 of them went to Angel Island, sent them off to 7 or 8 different Department of Justice camps across the country. So the next film is about that. Here's the incarceration. A Bitter Legacy is about incarceration. This is going to be about the real internment. So we're going to, you're going to learn a lot of untold stories about the DOJ, Department of Justice system.
These were a series of separate camps under the Department of Justice for the enemy aliens.
Yes.
You say many of
They
the
weren't
leaders.
They weren't even allowed to become citizens, even though they were residents for decades. The racist policies from back then still, Chinese Exclusion Act, all Asians were going to be excluded from citizenship. And when did the Japanese actually gain citizenship? In 53?
52 of the
52?
You say, yeah.
Yeah, the Walter McCarran Act.
Thank you. That's the good thing of having historians on the panel. So I think young people today are seeing this also in relationship to young immigrants being held in detention centers across the country, and especially in the South. So we've Suitor for Solidarity is is out with their voice and numbers saying the history is being repeated. We of all people know what it's like to be incarcerated and to be detained because of our race, and we want to speak out on behalf of these people seeking asylum in this country, and that's having it is having some effect. Fort Sill was they were going to detain kids there, and because of the demonstrations, and even the local people said, no, not in our back. No, we're not going to bring them here. And the government decided not to put a detention center in Fort Sill, which was what former DOJ, former military prison where Japanese were brought. I think 600 Japanese, 200 or 300 Japanese people were brought to Fort Sill. So my film will talk about the thousands of Issei and others who were community leaders who brought to the DOJ camp system. So,
yeah, I believe Fort Sill is designated as the center for receiving Afghan refugees.
Fort Bliss is. Fort Bliss.
Fort Bliss is.
Fort Bliss in Texas. Yeah, Suitor was just there with Suitor where we did a demonstration in Fort Bliss.
So they're converting that.
No, they already have all these tents and things, but they had thousands of Latin American people who were seeking asylum, and they started releasing some of them. I think it's now down to about 2,000 kids are still there, maybe a little bit less. And we hope the Biden administration releases all of them. They say they're trying to get, most of them have family members already in the country. And so they should be released. When we were there, there were a lot of Haitian immigrants who were being released. So
well, we have a question. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a question, Ken Mochizuki. What were the backgrounds of those who became members of the camp's internal security? Art, do you answer that?
I don't think that you can give a stereotypical answer to that. I mean, I think they were varied. I did do an interview with a person that was on the internal security thing at Manzanar, George Fukasawa. He was one of the only people that showed up on the night to duty on the night of the riot. He woke up and he didn't even know what was going on. He went out there and, he was fortunate. And then he ended up over there in Death Valley because they needed to protect him. They thought he was some kind of traitor or something. But George did have some police experience in Santa Monica where he came from. So I know about his background and everything. He was a photographer. He was a photographer at the Olympic Games in 1932 in Los Angeles, and he became a professional photographer. And the reason I interviewed him was he was a photography professor at Cal State Fullerton. So I interviewed him, but then I found out all this stuff about Manzanar and everything else like that. And he had actually been the president of the Santa Monica JACL chapter. So it may be that they did have some affiliation with JACL, and they may have had some military or paramilitary kind of, background and everything to go into that. But that's all I can tell you based on a huge sample of one person.
And it didn't determine your loyalty or anything per se either. But now, in closing, do you have any closing remarks or comments? We'll start with Art and then maybe wrap it up with Claudia.
Are there any other questions before we go that people want to insert into the chat, or are we not going to go there?
People can do that, but we have only about 3 minutes left to wrap
Art,
up.
Oh, sorry, we're going to wrap up. Art, you want to go?
Well, I think if the main point of this was to get people to find out more about Moab and Loop, both of them deserve, a book too.
Yes.
Or if it's a book on just the two isolation centers. But I mean, just this entry thing that I had at this is a starting point, but there's a rich story there that needs to go into, and we got to figure out the background of the people that were there and try to make some sense out of it. So that's one of the things that can come out of it. The other idea that both of these places were dress rehearsals for Tule Lake, this was a point that was brought up in your film. And I think that that's something to take a look at too. I mean, as Tess was calling it, they were all total institutions and everything, and they were like penitentiaries. And so you take any of the, even isolation center is kind of a euphemism. I mean, we need to know they were total prisons and everything. Yeah. So we need to deal with them in terms of peniology, really, not just sociology or psychology, but peniology and stuff. And so that's one of the things. The one thing that the activism of people, I think their activism shouldn't be, inclusive to just the Japanese American story.
Yes.
I mean, I think there are things out there right now, the whole idea of redress for African Americans for the centuries, of things that they went through. I mean, so I mean, we need to realize that others have been excluded from narratives. Women have been excluded from narratives. People, same-sex marriages have been excluded from the narrative and stuff. So we got to open up the narrative and give the full riches. That's what a democracy is. It's where everybody gets included in this. And so the inclusivity, I think, is extremely important, and because it's like when people say Black Lives Matter, we have to be able to know that they do matter a lot, but all lives matter. And so that's the reference point for us. All lives matter. Now, how do we make a country, for instance, that values all of its people, and respects people from other cultures and everything? This is the humanistic, mandate, I think, that we need to put into practice.
And Claudia, you want to wrap it up?
I wanted to start. I've been in writing about my next film. I came up with a concept that we should have a 12-step program for racism in this country. It's based on, Alcoholics Anonymous and all that. How do we, there is a large contingent of in this country that are, they hang on to their racist policies. They're afraid, and ultimately they're afraid. The white people are no longer going to be the majority, population in this country, and they can't accept that. They're afraid. But if they really looked at things and they were educated, they realized that this whole country is basically a nation of immigrants. Where did your family come from? If you're Irish, you were discriminated when you came to this country. So I think when people by going to sites like this and learning, when you educate yourselves about all the different ethnicities that are coming and have come to this country, and realize that we all want the same thing. We all want, a house, a roof over our heads. We want to make money. We want to do well for, help our children. We want to get educated. We want to have a good job. We want to be happy. And instead of, touting this hatred and this, but we know that there are people who are going to cling to that because they're afraid to let go of it. They're afraid. And how do you counter fear? Well, you learn from each other. You talk to each other. You sit in a room. I mean, Student for Solidarity, we use a lot of the healing circles. And if you get different people, different colors, different people, different ethnicities, different, if you just talk as people, you generally go, oh, well, he's got the same issues that I have. Oh, okay, well, I guess, I thought he was going to feel, he felt this about me. Oh, I guess, and I think I still want to develop that idea of, how do you attend a 12-step program for fighting racism? But I think the young people today realize that, no, the planet is falling apart. We got some bigger issues here, than the fear of other people. We've got to come together and really fight, forces that are really important for our survival on this planet. And so I hope people just, learn that, okay, well, you learn a little bit more history and see that, yes, how, my people went through the same thing, or, and how do we continue dialogue with each other, so that we can move forward. And, this is an incredible country. I mean, I've traveled all over the world, and I still choose to live here in America because it's an incredible, you have so much opportunity here.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I think, if you even tap it into the global warming and all, it is all related. It's the investigation of facts over, fiction and laying out the truth of what happened so that we can have a better understanding of who we are as human beings and how we treat each other. So this pilgrimage was an excellent example of finding those facts and digging deeper and asking the questions. So, I thank you, the bottom of our hearts, Kim Kumar and the
yes. Donate to this to Daima. Donate to us ninjas.
But to all our efforts, I think.
All our organizations.
Claudia's second film. The investigation continues. So, thank you very much. And we encourage young people to, again, do what you need to do, ask those questions and ask why. And we can't do this without you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Art, for being here. And
thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Kimiko, for all the work that you are doing, have done, and continue to do on behalf of the Japanese American community and the community at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much.